Paulina, thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to have you.
I'm so excited to be here.
So, I wanted to start by asking you what you do and why you do what you do.
It's a good question because I often talk about the fact that I'm very hard to put in a certain box. So the way I see myself is I'm just a curious human who writes for a living. um, and so I have a newsletter slash media company called The Profile, in which I study successful people every week and I share my learnings with my audience.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's I couldn't help when I was preparing for this episode um, see um, the similarities between being a podcaster and doing what you do. The research to the interviews, to really just this deep dive that you do into the people that you do a profile on. It was an interesting comparison that I didn't initially think when preparing for this episode.
Yeah, it's fascinating because basically you have to get to the essence of a human being in a very short period of time. And I think there's something about either interviewing people or watching them do interviews, because a lot of the time when I'm profiling these people, a lot of time I haven't met them in person. I myself haven't conducted the interview yet, but when I'm researching them, it's really interesting to pay attention to the cues that, when they are giving interviews. So, for example, we're on video right now recording this, and you can see that I talk with my hands a lot. Some other people may not do that. So it's like picking up on little things and being like, what makes your last guest different from me, different from the next guest? And if you stick with like superficial questions and superficial things, you don't actually get to the essence of what makes them them.
It's a great point. Do you have do you have some questions that really keep just coming up and to really do help get to the essence of a person?
One of the questions that I like to ask everybody that I interview is, how do you define success? Because that one question tells me so much about their worldview and the things that they value. So, for example, I was surprised to find out when I interviewed the CEO of a very, very large, if not the largest hedge fund in the world. I said, what does success mean to you? And he said, personal fulfillment and happiness and this stuff that normally I would have thought he was like, being at the top of a big hedge fund, something a little bit more quantifiable. But to him, it was very much like a spiritual journey to
Mm.
success. So I think it really like reveals your character and what you value in this world that most other things don't, or at least it gets you there the fastest.
And what does that look like for you? How do you define success?
Ah, good question. Uh, so to me, success is basically, if there's one thing that I've learned from all these people, is that success is not universal. There is no like one definition of success. It's very, very personal. And to me, success looks like going on this like kind of hero's journey, achieving a taste of something that you're very good and passionate about, failing miserably or having some sort of obstacle in your path, learning from that, and then continuing taking those learnings with you and continuing on that path and sharing those learnings with other people. To me, that's success. Like that means that you've taken your passion and you've shared it with other people. So for me, for example, when people are like, oh well, like what would you do if you weren't doing the profile? And honestly, the answer is I do not know, because the profile exists not because I was like, how do I make money, or how does this turn into a business or anything like that. It honestly, I do it because this is the way that I learn by reading about people, watching interviews of them, listening to podcasts with them, and then writing down what I learned. So I would do that for myself. So to me, like truly, I love doing this because I'm doing it for myself. And if I learn, then other people will learn too.
And I think it's such an important note when you said earlier talking about failing miserably. And that's a part of the journey that people don't want to talk about and people try to avoid. But such a common theme that I've seen throughout doing these podcasts is that the ability to take something, and something that for other people would have either broken them or would have made them
Mm-hmm.
quit, and turning that thing and taking that energy and transmuting it into the thing that propelled them to have success. So with that said, do you have a favorite failure, or a failure that you think really catapulted you to doing what you're doing now?
Yes, there's so many, but the one that just dramatically, fundamentally changed my life and the way that I view the world was when it was in 2013. I had graduated from the University of Georgia, and up until that point, I had identified as certain labels. So I was always a student my whole life, right? Up until then, I was recently an intern. I was the editor in chief of the college newspaper. I was a journalism major, like all these things that you use to label yourself. Where, if you go to a party on campus and somebody's like, ooh, like I know who that is, or this is who, whatever. So I had developed this like massive ego because all of my professors were like, you're going to have no problem getting a job after this. You have all this experience. You've done all the right things and you've checked all the right boxes. And what I've learned in this life is that you can check all the right boxes and then you still might completely fall flat on your face. It does not guarantee any sort of success. The world doesn't owe you anything. It doesn't matter. It just, there's sometimes time is against you. Sometimes, things happen. So when I graduated from college, media was in one of its cycles where everybody was getting laid off. Therefore, media companies weren't actively hiring new people. In my head, I thought I would graduate, I would get hired as like an investigative higher education reporter. Like I was that specific. So literally nobody was hiring. So I had to move back home with my mom and live on the couch for a year. And in that period of time, it really made me reflect on, hold on, like, A, how do I define success and why do I feel so miserable? And B, um, who am I? I had this like major existential crisis at 22 years old. Because I was like, I don't like, I'm Paulina. Like, what does that mean? I always thought that like your job title gave you status of some kind, or gave you confidence and so forth. And so since then, I've realized, like, never tie your identity around something that you can lose, because if it's anything external, then you are it's a recipe for like major disaster. Because if there, we all know people who tie their entire identity around the relationship they may have in that period of time, or the job they have, or like whatever sport they may play. If you get injured, done. If your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you, done. If you lose your job, done. Like those are all things that you are not in full control of. So over time, I kind of learned, like, start something that you only do for yourself, which is a big reason why I started the profile while still working at Fortune magazine, because I knew, yes, it sounds like very fancy to be like, I'm a tech reporter and editor at Fortune magazine, but I know that I could easily get laid off, I could get fired for whatever reason. That's not an identity I own. But creator and writer of the profile is very much something that I started for myself that nobody else can take away from
And what do you tie your identity to now? I know you kind of alluded to it, but
me. Yeah, and that's the beauty of it. Like, it's things that, again, can't be taken away from me. Like a writer, author, mother, like things that like kind of they they bring me confidence, because a lot of it, like writing, is a skill that even if the profile fails, if my book doesn't sell, if like all this happens, I can always like work more and get better at my craft to do something else. So I really believe it's like your unique perspective on the world, your experiences, and the skills that you've developed that should give you the self-worth that you have tomorrow.
And that unique perspective, it's something that, I've battled with a little bit in creating this podcast and starting to put out content in the world, and that imposter syndrome. Like, who am I to have an opinion on things? And I've heard you talk about that in the past as well. This, I don't want to call it imposter syndrome, but reluctance to have an opinion about things. Why do you feel
Mm-hmm.
that way? And what do you think the were the what were the positives of starting to have an opinion about things?
Yeah. So, okay, a few things. This used to be a really big deal for me. I always was like, yeah, but who would care what I have to say? Or I'm not an expert on this particular niche of things. And what I came to realize is that nobody cares except me. And the way I realized that is when I was making the decision to leave Fortune to go full time on the profile. I made a pro and cons list, and one of the things on the con list was I'll disappoint like people that I respect. And then I was like, when I looked at it objectively, I was like, how many times has somebody else doing what they want to do disappointed me? Like, when have I been sitting there, like, with my little scotch on the rocks, being like, you know, I'm really, really disappointed in so and so that they quit their job and they pursued that thing that they love full time. Like, I'm just so disappointed. Like, nobody sits home at night and reflects on your life decisions. If they do, that says more about them than you. But once I realized that, then it kind of led me to the thinking of Jim Cook, who is the creator of Samuel Adams beer. He had a really cushy job at Boston Consulting Group. And when he was making the decision, like, should I leave this really cushy job and go start this brewing company? He thought, like, is this decision scary or is it dangerous? Because if it's scary, that just means that you're scared to tell your boss, you're scared to quit, you're scared of like the small little immediate term things that are it's normal to be scared of. But those things pass. In 24 hours, you're gonna be like, oh, I feel so free, like all this stuff. And then if it's a dangerous decision, for example, to stay at Boston Consulting Group, that means that when you're 80 years old and you look back on your life, you're like, damn, I really, really regret not starting that thing that I had imposter syndrome about. And like, that's dangerous. Staying ends up being dangerous. So I think like once I started thinking about that, and then I thought, truly, literally, I do not think that anybody thinks about me so much that they're like, well, what does she know about X or whatever. And then the other thing is, when I was at Fortune, I was working on Term Sheet, which was their daily like deal making newsletter. That thing is so technical and so beastly, and you really, really have to know your stuff. The two prior writers of it had many, many years in venture capital, covering venture capital and tech before they wrote it. I had like two years. So to me, I felt this like horrible, oh my God, what am I going to do? But then what you realize is like people really appreciate people who can ask good questions and are willing to get to the truth via research, via interviews, etc. So I was like, I may not know everything, but I'm willing to work so hard that it'll show in my work. And I think by the end, that's why people respected my work, is because they were like, oh, okay, she really didn't just sit back and be like, you got to respect me because I know everything. It's like, let me talk to all the deal makers and understand their perspective and distill it for you.
It's so interesting, and it's a commonality that I've experienced within the podcast as well, as doing all these interviews and having this knowledge become ingrained into the person you are. And you've
Mm-hmm.
been doing this for a while now, and you mentioned it before in talking about was it Tim Cook, Jim Cook,
Jim Cook.
Jim
Mm-hmm.
Cook, and talking about Jim Cook. This thinking, it seeps into your brain and it comes out in conversations and in your actions. How do you think that covering all these people have changed the way you think and the way that you act?
What a great, yeah, way to think about it. So all the time I'll think of little things that somebody said, or little things that I read that maybe were kind of inconsequential to the bigger story, but they stuck with me for whatever reason. Um, One of those examples is around mental resilience, and there is a woman who her name's Courtney Dahlwalter, and she runs really, really long races, and she's done them. She's often called the Queen of Pain because she's known for like continuing to run and finish with a bleeding head injury. One time she was hallucinating really badly, but she somehow pushes through because she realizes like it's quote unquote just pain. And people are like, what do you mean? You have a broken foot. What do you mean it's just pain? And her whole point is like everybody in this life experiences pain, but like suffering is what's voluntary. So either you have the pain, you acknowledge the pain and you move on, or you kind of wallow in that suffering. And I think I was somebody who was very much like, I would ruminate and I would worry about things that I couldn't control. But her framework of, she personifies pain in a way that she's like, I'm running. I know that eventually I'm going to like meet this pain cave and I'm going to enter this pain cave. And she calls it the pain cave. So she visualizes her going into a pain cave. And then she's like, and then I know that I'm in control of when I come out. So it's like really, really helpful to know that this isn't just like a black hole of pain that you will be stuck in forever. By visualizing something like a place, like a cave, that you are in control when you enter and you are just as in control as when you leave, is really helpful because it makes pain temporary, not something that's like you're going to suffer for the rest of your life.
How has that? How have you used that? Can you give me an example?
Let me think of a specific example. Well, I don't know how applicable this is to your audience, but when I had my daughter, I was really, really scared of the actual like birth
Mm.
process. Um, but like I very much like use that. In So in the book, I use three examples of this. Courtney's one of them. David Goggins, who many people might be familiar, is another. He also personifies pain. He calls it a dark room. And he's like, when you enter the dark room, that's where metamorphosis happens and it'll change you. And basically, if you don't break, you will transform. There is no other out. And then the third example I have is Anthony Ray Hinton. By the way, if you haven't read his memoir, it's called The Sun Does Shine. Incredible book. He was wrongfully imprisoned on death row for 30 years. He saw like 50 men go past his cell to be electrocuted in Alabama. And he was there for a crime he didn't commit for 30 years. And he, as you can imagine, most people would go crazy in that sort of environment. They would lose their sanity. But the way he, his dark room and his pain cave was a solitary confinement cell. And he used his brain. He read a lot of books. He visualized winning Wimbledon and like having tea with the queen, like all these things, to get himself out of that small confined cell. So it, when I was like going through the birth process, I was like, I know that this is temporary, and also I know that like when you basically the person I will be on the other side of this is a totally different human. And it was true. Like you completely transform from this one like really traumatic event.
It's interesting, you and your husband's relationship, because you both are very high performers, and it's something that fascinates me. What does that dynamic look like? Do you guys talk about stuff like this? Do you guys have these very intellectual conversations, and does that seep into becoming a better writer? Do you think that your relationship has really helped propel you to even more success?
No, most of the time I'm just yelling at him about random things he didn't do. I'm kidding.
Makes sense.
No. Well, actually, it's really interesting. When we first met, I was like 25 and we met at a coffee shop. And for some reason, like I had been thinking about this, and I was like, I just want to, I don't know how the conversation steered in this direction, but I was like, do you think that two ambitious people can be together like
It's a good
long term?
question.
Right? Because for me, for a long time, I really truly believed that for two partners to have a long-standing relationship, one had to kind of be on in the back seat while the other one drove, right? Like one is really ambitious, the other one not really. They're just more of the supportive partner. And then I didn't have any like models of great relationships in my life. So I asked him this question, and he had an interesting answer in which was, there's two types of relationships that really can thrive. So usually like the high school sweethearts that last, the only way they last is if both people grow together, right? And then the second type of relationship is the people who have gone on their own kind of hero's journeys, alone. They're both very ambitious, and then they kind of happen to meet at a point in time where they're ready to kind of merge their ambitions with somebody else. And I definitely agree with that, because I don't think if I was with somebody that I knew in high school or college, that we would be able to grow together in the same way. I think those people are very, very rare. So, yeah. So basically, what we do is, um, uh, okay. Sorry to connect this to somebody else, but
Please do.
Sarah Blakely, who's been married to Jesse Itzler for a very long time, she said that the key to having a long, healthy marriage was that they engage in like intellectual play. And
Hmm.
she's like, it's just, yeah, it's just like, I think she said like something like 90% of our relationship is just ideas. It's Jesse saying something crazy to her, being like, what if I go live with monks? And she's like, what the hell? Sure. But it's just like constantly coming up with new ideas, and that's what makes life exciting. And I think that's very much the case for us. Like we go on these long walks every Saturday and Sunday morning, and during those walks we get to talk about like ideas and things that like, what can I help you with this month? What can you do to be a better partner for me next month? Whatever. And like these things are constantly keeping you on your toes, and you don't have to, like, that's the only way you don't get stagnant.
I love that question. Can two ambitious people be together? It was it's a better version of the question I was trying to ask, because it's so true, because it's something that I've thought about as well, and I don't think that
Mm-hmm.
the answer as a 22-year-old was very clear for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And why have you been thinking about that?
Mainly curiosity. I think that's very very similar to yourself. I'm a curious person, and I read a lot, listen to a lot of podcasts, and people talk about their relationships, and it makes you think. And there's so much, I like the almost like the Andrew Tate type of content going out there,
Mm.
which is like
Mm-hmm.
the manosphere type of, you want your wife or your girlfriend to serve you and to
Mm-hmm.
help you succeed, and she takes care of the kids and you take care of the money, blah blah blah. So because of so much of that content going on, it kind of just makes my wheel spin. Like, is that the reality of how a successful relationship works, that you need these kind of polar energies coming together, or
Mm-hmm.
is there some middle ground there that produces equal success?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, exactly. Forget Andrew Tate like for a second,
Yeah.
but I I think like yes, there's a lot of that stuff online, and there's a lot of like, here's how to date women, that whatever. But it's all crap, and I really genuinely believe that the best tell if somebody's a good match for you is probably if they ask you questions and are genuinely curious. Like, I can't tell you the number of people I've met where I was like, I'm going to turn this into a game where I look at my watch and I'm like, let's see how long I can go with just asking questions and see if they ask me a single question back. And the sad answer to that is a really long time.
It's so
And
true.
right? Like you can tell so much about whether somebody's just putting on a performance or genuinely wants to get to know you.
It's so interesting, and it's something that the skill of the podcast is it's transformed. I feel like my relationships and my ability to just ask good questions and follow my curiosity and actually listen. It
Mm-hmm.
blows my mind. I don't think that I realized how little I was listening before I started doing this podcast, because
Yeah.
there's an art to it. There's a genuine emptiness in it. It's almost like a meditation when you're truly listening. And I don't think I got to that point before doing the podcast. Sorry.
That's and I see you, no, and I see you like not only asking questions but like writing down, I'm guessing, keywords or things you want to follow up on. That's the skill of listening. Have you heard of Amaryllis Fox?
No, but I'm excited to hear
Oh
your
God.
take on
Oh,
it.
you would love. Okay. So, I mean, probably nobody has heard of her, or very few people, but Amaryllis Fox was only 21 years old when she got recruited into the CIA, and not just the CIA, but the top secret unit of the CIA. It was like Black Ops. I mean, incredible. So she was really young. She went in and she's done she's gone abroad and dealt with like really dangerous arms dealers and people like that. But her whole like lesson is being able to really listen intently is the art of a good, whether it's a hostage negotiation, whether it's like you're trying to get somebody to like tell you where the weapons are, whatever. So she says like the key is like everybody thinks they're the good guy. Like nobody actually sits down like, oh, I'm the bad guy here. No. And she was like, if you actually take the time to listen, even to terrorists, you may realize that had you been in their shoes, you may have made some of the same or similar choices that they made in their life, whether it's to feed their kids, I'm dealing arms because I have to take care of my sick mom. Like everybody has some sort of reason for what they're doing, because nobody thinks they're the bad guy. And sorry, final thing on her and then we can move on, but she has this really interesting anecdote of when she was little, her dad was trying to teach her about perspective. And like when you're asking questions, you're you, but you always have to think about the person you're asking questions to and their perspective. So they were sitting at the dinner table and it was her and her brother, and their dad held up like this shape, this object, and he asked her, what do you see? And she says, I see a triangle. And then he asked her brother and he said, what are you talking about? It's a square. So an argument was about to erupt, and he was like, he turned the object and he was like, by the way, this is a pyramid. So you are actually genuinely seeing a triangle from your perspective, but Amaryllis, you're seeing a square because you're on the other side. So he held up this pyramid and he was like, whenever you're in an argument with someone, always think about the fact that there's a higher dimension or a higher object. And if I hadn't told you this, you guys would have assumed like each other was not only wrong, but like stupid and at worst malicious, because you're so sure about what you're seeing. But it may not be what the other person's seeing. So it's like, I always keep that in mind in terms of like when you listen, especially in relationships or business negotiations, what is the other person's perspective and why might they feel wronged or however they may feel, and how can you like be like, okay, hold on one second, what is the higher purpose of this conversation?
That empathy, it's so
Mm-hmm.
important, and transforms, like you said, relationships and the way you ask questions. What
Exactly.
what do you think makes for a good question?
Mm. Once I heard he's the creator of This American Life. His name's Ira Glass. He's an amazing interviewer, obviously. But he said something like he likes to ask questions where there's a gap. And what he means by that is like, how has your life turned out in a way that you maybe didn't expect it to? So, like when you're young, you had this like vision of what your life would be. Now you're older, and does it look like that? And if it doesn't, what is that gap? Brandon Stanton, who's the creator of Humans of New York, has a kind of similar question where he's like, what is your greatest regret? Again, it's reflective and it makes people think about the gap in expectations and reality. I think those are really powerful questions. And like, let me think about this. A really great question is one that makes you pause and think. But I genuinely believe, like, if you get to know how the person thinks based on your research, whatever, asking them something that makes them reflect on their life in a way that they haven't before. And actually, Brandon says that most of us empathize more with our struggles in life than our like achievements and successes. So we've all maybe experienced heartbreak, somebody dying, things like that. Those are universal emotions. Maybe a lot of us haven't won a Nobel Peace Prize. It's like much harder to relate to someone who's achieved great achievement or status or whatever, as much as it is like the basic human traumas we've all experienced.
So true. I think that there's a quote that I'm going to butcher, but it's the pain that's closest to the heart is that which is most universal. Something along those lines.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And
So
do
good.
you have a biggest regret? I'm
Damn
just
it,
using
Ryan!
this.
I'm
I'm
gonna
just throwing
stop.
it back at you.
I'm gonna
You're making
stop
this
telling
easy
you
for me.
questions. Oh, okay. So my it's interesting. My biggest regrets always have something to do with like timing and not doing something soon enough. Like I always kind of wait until it's like the perfect time to do things. And then I'm like, damn, like I should have done this 5 years ago. A good example is recently, I don't know if you saw this, but I was searching in my email and I happened to come across this audio of this, sorry, of this psychic when I was at Fortune magazine. I did this article on psychics who advise CEOs. And I got a lot of against my will readings during this because I would interview them and then they'd be like, do you want a reading? And I'd be like, okay, I guess maybe I can include it in the article. So one of those interviews, the intuitive, I found the audio recording of me being 23 years old, talking to her. And she goes, I don't see you as being a corporate girl. I don't think you're going to be in this role for very long. I have a feeling you're going to do something bigger than this. And I'm seeing a book. I was like, at the time, when we were on the phone, you could just hear me. If you listen to the recording, you just hear me be like, interesting. Because everything she was saying, I was like, this is so false because I had just left a startup that I didn't enjoy to come to Fortune. So I was on top of the world. I was like, I'm gonna be here for the rest of my life. What does she mean I'm not a corporate girl? I love corporate. Um, and then and then when she said the book, I was like, again, I had always identified myself as someone who wrote short pieces, like articles. Like I never thought in something bigger. So I just whatever, I let go. That was 8 years ago. And so now being like, damn, like whatever, forget everything that she was saying, whether you believe or not. But I was like, I truly, what if I had considered an ounce of truth to whatever? Should I write a book? Should I find my voice? Should I consider doing something other than like corporate life? And then, if I had started sooner, maybe things would have turned out differently. It's not necessarily a regret, but more of like a wonder.
That's a good way to put it. And what do you make of that experience, looking back on it now?
Which one?
Of the psychic experience.
Oh, it was okay. So again, like I wrote in the piece, it's not that, like, basically I understand why people seek spiritual advisors out. And I think it's less to do with like predictions. And I think it's more to do with things that you already intuitively know but you kind of need an outside person to tell you those things. So in the recording, you'll hear her be like, "Oh, you seem like you have a voice that, or and you have a story that more people need to hear, but like you're scared to put yourself out there and actually write. You kind of hide behind other people." And so I was like, "Oh yeah, I do that." And I know that. but like I just kind of needed somebody else to tell me those things in order for me in the future to be reflective. But it's like, what if we didn't need that external validation? Like, what if we found ways to ask ourselves these questions every so often of, am I doing what I genuinely want to do? And does this make me happy? Each one of us has a voice. Like, you started this podcast for a specific reason. Like, if you had never reflected internally, you might have never started it. So it's like, how many of us go through life just completely on autopilot without stopping and being like, I could go a number of different ways here. Let's see what would make me happy. And that's why I talk about, like, start something that you only do for yourself. It doesn't have to make money, doesn't have to figure out like what kind of business it's going to be. Do it just because it makes you happy, and then you never know where it'll take you.
And you learn so much in that process, and you
So
organize your
much.
thinking. So it's crazy, and it's one of the beauties of writing is how much it
Mm-hmm.
organizes your thinking. It's truly remarkable.
Totally. That's why I love it.
Yeah. And so with that, it seems almost like a little crazy when you talking about the psychic and that whole experience. Like, do you believe that there's something there? How do you think that she or they, I don't know how many you went to, but how do you think that they got a glimpse of your inner thoughts?
Like, look, like I mean, so if you listen to the interview, I don't say much. That
Mhm.
she did not know. Well, she didn't know anything about me in terms of, she didn't even know how old I was. So in that sense, she didn't know me. But you could argue, like, you're a journalist. Is there a possibility you write a book in the future? Some journalists have, like, there are those things. But I for me, it was more like, what did she see in me that I necessarily didn't see in myself, but also knew? Like, when she was saying these things, the predictions, I was like, this is totally off. But the things that she was saying about me personally, I was like, damn, like, is that what my energy is giving off? And I think, uh, in a really weird way, I'm sure you do this too. But for me, it's like when I interview someone, I get this, like, and then it's over, and then they leave. I feel this really bizarre, like, after they leave, I'm like, ooh, okay. I kind of like feel what kind of person they are. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of feel the energy linger a little bit. And that's not to say I'm psychic. I'm just saying, like, you feed off of the other person's energy. That's why, like, when I go on podcasts or something, we have a really good conversation. I feel kind of on a high afterwards. And then there's other people where, like, it was okay. And I'm just kind of like, that could have gone better. But I think it really does require both people kind of feeding off of each other's energy.
Absolutely, and I feel that as well. And have you ever, you mentioned the psychic seeing something in you that maybe
Mm-hmm.
you didn't see it in yourself at the time. Do you think you've ever left a profile of somebody and saw something in them that they might have not seen in themselves?
Yes. Although I think that he very much saw it. So, um, okay. So I've interviewed a lot of people, and the one that really just kind of like stuck with me for a very long time was, Robert Hogue. Have you heard of him?
No, I don't think
No,
so.
yeah. So Robert, he has a normal job. He's written a book. He's done a TED Talk, but he's not somebody that many people would know. He was born with a massive, like, tumor in the middle of his face. And you might have seen the baby photo. A lot of people were like, "Wow, this is the ugliest baby ever born." So, like, he basically, when he was born, starting day one, he was labeled ugly, to the point where his mom didn't want to take him home from the hospital because she was like, it's going to be a really hard life for our family with this baby because he is so ugly. And during our interview, Robert actually read me the journal entry that his mom had at that point in time, right after she had given birth, and she didn't want to take him home. And it's like the most raw, like vulnerable thing. Like, imagine your own mom being like, you are too ugly. Usually parents are like, oh my God, they may have like a weird looking nose, but it's my baby. Like, so him, and he went his whole life. He had so many surgeries to his face. One of his legs was like mangled. So during school, he was severely bullied, called ugly, called Pinocchio, called like all these different things. And he emerged from it not bitter, not, like, I hate the world, humans are awful people, like, I have been surrounded by this hate all my life. But instead, he basically realized, like, his memoir is called Ugly. He took that word and he kind of reframed it, and he was like, I've realized that beauty is so subjective, and beauty is kind of like different points on a map. You can't be like, oh, that exact thing is beautiful. It's like, no, it's all these different things that like make something beautiful. So to me, I came off that call and I was like, oh my God, like, he is the most beautiful human I have ever met, even though objectively some may argue like, he's ugly or whatever we perceive. Because it's so interesting, like, what I perceive as beautiful, you might not, and what you find beautiful, I may not. So it's so funny that, like, in society we have these objective things of this is beautiful and this is not. It's like totally subjective. So he's one of the people that I think about all the time.
It's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
And I'm going to I need your help. So
Tell me.
I'm having a crisis lately of not knowing who to ask to come on the podcast. And I
Okay.
have been a little all over the place, and I'm like, where do I turn? So I wanted to ask you about finding people and what your
Mm-hmm.
process is like for um who you decide to write a piece on, because it is a big commitment, and I want to do these deep dives into people in preparation for a
Mm-hmm.
podcast. And for that commitment, I want to make sure it's somebody worthy of doing that too. How do you go about figuring that out?
So what's interesting is that your podcast, the premise of your podcast, is very much like what I look for before deciding to profile someone. So the whole premise of your podcast is like transformation, right? Like radical inner transformation. And I personally find those stories to be the most appealing and the most compelling, is when someone was on this path and then something crazy happened, like an atomic bomb, collapsed their life. And then they had to figure out who they were and how they would reinvent. So ultimately, it's kind of a story about reinvention. But, like, for example, the way that what I look for in people's journeys is not somebody who has like a linear path of success or whatever linear. That's not how life works. And if it is, like, if that is what your life looks like, you haven't taken enough risks and done enough to like really figure out what you want. So I look for like the winding path. I look for like somebody who like went down this road, something happened, they had to pivot and go down a different road. And there's so many examples of this. Like, for example, you know, Martha Stewart is a good example. She literally went to prison for insider trading after
Really?
building. Oh yeah, did you not know this?
I did not know that. No.
This is the beauty of Martha Stewart. um, that basically, like, she was the original, like the OG influencer. She had a magazine, she had a talk show, she had a radio show, she had all these things, and they were all really successful. And she built a huge brand around like gardening and cleaning and things that normally were considered like women's work. And she turned it into like a brand and something like $1 billion company. And so she did all that. She was on this crazy path, and then she went to prison for insider trading. And there, she says, like, while there, she was thinking about her next iteration and what she would do and how she would come back and rebuild like stronger. And the beauty of Martha Stewart is that she's appealed to my grandmother's generation, to my mother's generation, now to my generation with like Snoop Dogg and like I'm cool now. I have, thirst traps coming out of a pool in my swimsuit. Like she knows what she's doing and she's very methodical, but it's very, very rare to have somebody reinvent so many times without becoming complacent. So I think like basically what you need to look for is massive transformations and people going in directions that are intuitive for them, if that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. And we've only barely alluded to the fact that you're writing this book. I think you're probably done with the book now. It's coming out pretty soon. What
Yeah.
was the hardest part about writing the book?
The hardest part was it was committing to writing the book. The actual writing of the book was like, it almost felt like, you know, my like I knew what I had so much information that I wanted to distill in this book that it was almost easy. Like it felt like a weight off my shoulders to write it. And I think you probably, if you don't feel like this yet, you will in the future, where you've interviewed so many people that you want to take all of their lessons and compile them into something that is easy to access and like for people to learn from. So for me, like I it felt good to finally finish it, but the actual committing to the book was the hard part because and really good like editors and really good listeners know this. When I was talking to my editor, and he was like, because he reached out to me, I was not seeking out to write a book. I did not pitch a publishing house to do a book. Basically, I was just writing my newsletter, and all of a sudden, an editor from a London-based publishing house was like, "Hey, we published Morgan Housel's book, Psychology of Money. We work with some American writers. I really like your stuff. If your thoughts ever turn to writing a book, because he's
Mm,
British and it's so eloquent,
so
if your
eloquent.
thoughts ever turn to writing a book, like let us know." So I was just curious. Like I was just curious what this entailed. So I agreed to do a call with him, but it was just me asking questions. It was nothing like no commitment or anything. And he was like, "So like if you were to write a book, what would you write about?" And I was like, "Well, I've learned from all these people, like maybe kind of a lessons of everything I've learned." He was like, "Okay, that's interesting. Send us like a paragraph of that. And then I'll talk to my coworkers and I'll just give you an opinion." I was like, "Oh, okay." And so he was like, "We like this. Can you write a sample kind of like table of contents? What would each chapter look like?" And I was like, "I'll do that. It's easy. Like, it takes 20 minutes." And then it was like piecemeal, like chunk by chunk. And then it turned into a book. Honestly, yeah. And I didn't tell anybody until I had finished the book and it was available for a pre-sale that I was writing a book, not even like close
Wow.
friends, because I was like, it's truly, I don't think I'm going to finish it. So I don't want to like, you know, break my promise.
That original table of content that you wrote, how is that different than the final, and why? What changed? What did you think coming into writing the book was different than when you actually wrote the book?
Yeah. Originally, the book was going to be mental models. Each
Oh,
chapter was going to
interesting.
be a different mental model, but like specific to how, these like really top performers think. But part of me was like, A, I don't think the world needs another mental models book. And two, I had a hard time. It more felt like I was kind of like trying to like stick people into different mental models even though they didn't really fit there, and I was like, "Oh, I don't like it, feels forced."
Hmm.
So once I realized that, I was like, I mean, can I just like do what I've always done and I do best, which is here's a theme. And I don't know why my mind works this way, but it's literally like I'll meet 17 people and 3 of them I'm like, they're the same person, even if they are like they think similarly. even if the one is a doctor, the other one's an ultra runner, and the third one was wrongfully imprisoned on death row. I'm like, the way that they think, and it is totally unique to them, but they have this like underlying similarity. So my chapters are now based around theme, and each chapter has a number of examples of people. So, for example, in the creativity chapter, I have the co-founder of Pixar, a the chef of the top restaurant in the world, and Elon Musk. Like those three people normally, like maybe they don't go together, but to me, it's so obvious. So that's how it changed.
Very cool. And I'm excited to dive into it. It sounds incredible. And the book
Yeah.
is called Hidden Genius, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And when does it come out?
June 20th.
Nice. Very soon. Coming up. You
Yeah.
nervous?
You know, a little bit. Because somebody recently told me, like, when you write a book, it's for you, but the second you release it out to the world, it's no longer yours. And I kind of feel that way because I know that like people will read it and come away with totally different things that I intended maybe. But then it becomes theirs. So like I'm enjoying this time of, wait, can I leave you with one quote that I recently
Please,
like
please do.
thought about? Um, so Lin Manuel Miranda, who's the playwright behind Hamilton, which is that like hit musical, he said something like, he said, "I love the quiet in which it takes to pursue an idea, like I did with Hamilton, but I could never write a book because there's no applause at the end." And to me, it was like, what? No, like I thrive in that quiet. Like, why do you care about the applause? Um, but I think it's more of like your incentives and the reason that you do things. I truly wrote this book for myself. If not a single soul reads it, I'll know that I learned through the process. But if somebody does learn, like that makes it 10 times more like gratifying for me. But I definitely wrote the book in the quiet because I really, really enjoy like pursuing the idea.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think you enjoy that quiet so much? Because we live in a world that's so hyper focused on the applause, and of social media,
Mm-hmm.
they're doing it for the likes and not for the quiet and for the idea generation.
Yeah, I my whole life I've never really like chased dopamine or like short term. I don't know, it doesn't make me happy. Yeah, short term pleasure. It's always like I always really enjoy like working on these thorny, meaty, long term things that you work really hard creating it, and then when it's complete, you're like, whoa, that came from my brain. You know what I mean? Like when I saw the
Absolutely.
book in its physical form, I was like, that was once just in my brain. It blows my mind.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Is there,
Yeah.
if there's one lesson that you hope people take away from the book, what do you think? What do you think that is?
It's so I write the entire book, and then in the conclusion, there's a list of 10 questions that the reader can ask themselves after reading the 10 chapters in hopes of helping them find their own hidden genius. And it's a lot of asking, like, again, like what we talked about earlier, being self reflective and being like, what does my content diet look like? Like, what do I put in my brain? Who do I surround myself with, etc. What does success mean to me? And like, how do I define it? When is the last time that I took a risk on something that was very uncertain, but I really wanted to do it? And it's like, if you answer those questions, it'll give you kind of a complete picture or a more complete picture of you. And so I hope that people take that away. Like, I hope that they find their own hidden genius.
I hope so as well, and I think that that's such a great idea to finish the book in that way. It's very cool.
Thank you, Ryan.
Well, Paulina, this was such a blast. I really appreciate you and your time, and looking forward to reading the book.
Yeah, no, it'll be great. I'm really excited and thank you for having me on your show.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.